Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis. Now, American Psycho was published in 1991, and this is probably Ellis's most famous book, and many would claim that it's his masterpiece. Personally, I like Less Than Zero better than this, but that's just on a personal level. I would say writing-wise, this is probably the superior novel. And reading this in comparison with Less Than Zero, you can really see how Bret Easton Ellis improved as a writer from when he wrote Less Than Zero to when he wrote this book. Now, while you can read American Psycho as a standalone novel, the book is actually sort of a semi-sequel to Bret Easton Ellis's second novel, The Rules of Attraction, because Patrick Bateman from this book first showed up in that novel, and his fiancée Evelyn also showed up in that novel as well. Also, one of the main characters of Rules of Attraction was Patrick Bateman's brother Sean, and Sean also shows up in this book. Now, kind of like Stephen King or Elmer Leonard, a lot of Bret Easton Ellis's books actually take place in the same continuity, so this book actually has some minor connections with several of Bret Easton Ellis's other books. And I'll address some of those connections after I talk about the book itself. Now, when this book was first published, it was extremely controversial, and a lot of feminists at the time attacked the novel, calling it misogynistic, and Bret Easton Ellis actually received death threats because of this book, which I think is ridiculous. I can understand if you're taking the novel on face value. I can understand being a little offended by it if you're only looking at it on the surface. The way people reacted to this, you would think Bret Easton Ellis actually killed people. I mean, come on. It's a novel. It's a fictional story. None of this is real. Grow the fuck up. Thankfully, a lot of people have reevaluated this book over the years to a point where now there are a lot of people who actually consider this to be a feminist novel, because the book is actually a satire and a critique of masculinity and misogyny. Yes, Patrick Bateman is a misogynist, so are most of his friends in this book. He's also a racist and a homophobe. There's actually a lot of homophobia in this book, but I'm pretty sure Bret Easton Ellis is gay, so obviously the book is not meant to condone Patrick Bateman's behavior. And the fact that Patrick Bateman holds these views, but is also a serial killer, should have made it pretty obvious what the book is saying about people who hold those views. But again, at the time, people just kind of looked at this book on the surface, which is kind of ironic given that one of the themes of the book is looking beyond the surface. Now, this book was written years later, but I actually would compare this novel to Chuck Palahniuk's Fight Club, because both this and Fight Club are sort of these indictments of masculinity and all the negative aspects of male behavior. And also, kind of like Fight Club, there is a certain point where we as the reader and the protagonist are also sort of questioning reality. Now, the plot of American Psycho is it's set in the late 1980s, and it follows a young Wall Street investment banker named Patrick Bateman, who is a very selfish, vain person. And he's also a very shallow person, and he's obsessed with material and status and class and appearances. And you eventually learn that this guy is actually a sadistic serial killer, and he only becomes more unstable as the story progresses. Now, American Psycho is a brilliant novel if you're not just reading it as one thing. The novel could be read on so many different levels. It's a social and even political satire, it's a black comedy, it's a serial killer drama, and it's a horror novel. And I can understand the novel not being everybody's cup of tea, because this is a very disturbing book. Like, some of the things that Patrick Patrick Bateman does to people, especially women, is so freaking stomach-churning. Now, as I pointed out already, I don't personally consider the book to be a misogynistic novel, because at no point do I think the book is actually condoning what Patrick Bateman does, but I could see people being kind of turned off by all the violence towards women in this book. And he doesn't just kill women in this book, he also kills one of his male co-workers, a man named Paul Owen, and that becomes a major plot point in this story. He also mutilates a homeless person, he kills animals, he even kills a child at one point. But what oddly makes the violence even more disturbing is outside of the violence, there's actually a lot of humor in this book. This is actually a really, really funny novel. Like, there are actually times in this book where Patrick Bateman is kind of hilarious and even gets into some hilarious situations. And Bret Easton Ellis does give Bateman some humanizing moments, but that makes it even more disturbing because you realize that underneath this surface is a very, very ugly individual. Now, besides being a savage portrait of male behavior, another one of the novel's main themes is definitely class. Class and privilege. And in the novel, Patrick and his friends absolutely hate poor people, and they view themselves as being superior because of their economic status. And there are a lot of moments in this book where either Patrick or one of his friends would, like, wave $1 in a homeless person's face and then quickly snatch the dollar away and then laugh at them. And a common theme that you see throughout a lot of Ellis's work is this idea that sociopathic behavior is allowed to thrive in privileged environments. What's ironic is Patrick and his friends, they criticize homeless people for being lazy and they act like it's their faults for being homeless. Meanwhile, we never actually see Patrick or his friends actually working at their jobs. And you very much get the idea that none of these people actually worked to get their positions. And you could very much view the novel as an indictment on Wall Street greed, and the whole concept of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. But it really does play on this idea that what if one of these rich motherfuckers that you see behind closed doors is the worst kind of human being on the planet? Again, it's this idea that status almost breeds evil. The novel is also very much a satire on 1980s America and commercialism and materialism. And there are a lot of moments in this book where Patrick would be describing the products he's using, or the restaurants he's going to, or the suits people are wearing, where he would actually name off the fashion designer or the company that made said suits. So it gets to a point where you almost feel like you're reading an ad for whatever product Patrick Bateman is using. And Patrick, he's obsessed with the material, and you realize that a part of this is because conformity is really important to him, and fitting in is really important, probably so he could mask what he's actually doing. Now, I do think there's a statement about homophobia in this book. Like, at one point in the novel, Patrick Bateman sees a gay pride parade, and he's absolutely disgusted by this, and he even says at one point, how can a man take pride in sodomizing another man? Meanwhile, this is a guy who sadistically tortures and murders women, and yet he's disgusted by two men being in love with each other. So, kind of like the misogyny, I don't think the book is ever actually condoning Patrick's views on homosexuality, rather it's showing just how disgusting homophobia really is. Now, there's a character in this book named Lewis who is a closeted homosexual, and Patrick absolutely despises him, and there's one point in this book where he tries to kill Lewis but fails, and Lewis interprets this as Patrick coming on to him. But there are some really funny scenes in the book between Lewis and Patrick. Now, I know some people have read into the possibility that perhaps Patrick Bateman is gay himself, and he's sort of a self-loathing gay man. I'm not sure if I agree with that or not, but it's an interesting theory. But it's interesting that throughout the book, Patrick has a fiancée named Evelyn, who you realize he doesn't really like that much, but there are little moments in the book where it seems like he might have some affection for her, but you really do get the idea that those little moments are him sort of convincing himself of that. But meanwhile, in the book, he's also having an affair with a woman named Courtney, who is ironically engaged to the character of Lewis. The only female character in this book that Patrick seems to have any sort of real affection for is Jean, his secretary, but that's only because she's completely submissive to him and is, in his words, in love with him. But even Jean, he doesn't really treat that well. Like, you really do get the idea that this guy isn't capable of any sort of real affection. Now, there is a level of ambiguity to this novel where you're not sure how much of this is actually real and how much of it is just in Bateman's head. Now, my personal interpretation is I think some of the murders were probably just imagined, and some of them I do think were real. Like, I think it's a mixture of both, but some people interpret it as none of it was real and it was all in Patrick Bateman's head. Like, at one point in this book, and this could be considered kind of a spoiler, but at one point Patrick Bateman actually confesses to these murders to his lawyer, but then his lawyer's like, "That's not possible. One of the people you said you killed, I just had dinner with him in London 10 days ago." But you also get this idea that pretty much all the characters in this book are kind of caught up in their own little worlds and are kind of detached from reality to a certain extent. Like, his lawyer can't even get his name right, and a lot of the characters in this book consistently refer to Patrick by different names. So in the novel, you're not sure if it's really Patrick who's detached from reality, or if it's the people around him who are detached from reality, or perhaps both. Now, as I point out already, one of Patrick's victims is his co-worker, Paul Owen, and there's a certain point where he kills some hookers in Owen's apartment, and towards the end of this novel, there's a scene where he goes to Owen's apartment to dispose of the bodies, but when he gets there, he finds the apartment has been completely cleaned out, and there's a real estate agent there selling the apartment. And a lot of people have interpreted this as, okay, this was all in his head, but the way I kind of saw that scene is, oh no, they found the bodies, this real estate agent just didn't want to deal with it, because if this was known that they found bodies in this apartment, that would have ruined any chances of her selling the apartment. So the real estate agent knows exactly what Patrick Bateman did. That's why when he shows up there and he says he's looking for Paul Owen, obviously he's lying when he says that. She's like, never come back. Again, she just didn't want to deal with it. So that's another profound statement about society if you interpret the scene that way. Now, throughout the novel, Patrick watches this daytime talk show called The Patty Winters Show, and I saw one fan theory that perhaps this show wasn't even real, like it's another figment of Patrick's imagination, because the topics on this show, as the story goes on, get progressively more and more absurd to a point where Bigfoot is actually a guest on one of the episodes of the show. But again, the book is a satire, and with the Patty Winters Show, you could tell that Bret Easton Ellis was sort of riffing on daytime talk shows. Now, some of my favorite parts of this book were actually the chapters in which Patrick Bateman would talk about music. Like, there are whole chapters in this book devoted to bands like Genesis and Huey Lewis and the News, and musicians like Whitney Houston. And he actually has some really insightful things to say about music, but very quickly you realize that he prefers the commercial music because, again, conformity is a big part of Patrick Bateman's philosophy. One thing that's interesting to note is in the novel, Patrick is kind of obsessed with Donald Trump, and there's a lot of references to Trump throughout the novel. Of course, this novel was written decades before this man would become President of the United States. Now, I'm not saying how I feel about this one way or the other, but let's just say in the Trump era, some people have kind of taken another look at this novel. Again, make of that what you will. But yeah, American Psycho is an excellent novel, but this is not a book for everybody at all. Like, this is a very disturbing novel, even stomach-churning, but if you look past all the violence in the book is actually saying a lot of profound things about society, and even though there's a lot of serious social commentary in the book, it's also a very funny book as well. So I do recommend the book, but I don't recommend it for everybody. Now, as I pointed out already, a lot of Bret Easton Ellis's books actually take place in the same universe. I already mentioned the connections between this and the Rules of Attraction. There are also some connections with Less Than Zero. In this novel, there's a character named Tim Price who is one of Patrick's friends, and he would show up in Bret Easton Ellis's book, The Informers. Patrick Bateman would later show up in Glamorama and Lunar Park. Now, Lunar Park was not exactly in continuity with this, because that was actually sort of a mock autobiography in which Bret Easton Ellis himself was the main character. The whole premise of that novel is Bret Easton Ellis is being haunted by a demon from hell, and his stories are starting to come to life, so when Patrick Bateman shows up in that book, you're not sure if it's really him or just the demon taking on the form of him. But I do actually consider Lunar Park to be sort of a metafiction sequel to American Psycho, because so much of that book is about how this book affected Bret Easton Ellis's life. And Donald Kimball, the private investigator from this book, also shows up in Lunar Park, because in that novel you start to see reality and fiction start to merge together. In this novel, there's an appearance from a character named Allison Poole, who you find out was sexually assaulted by Patrick Bateman in the past, and she's actually a character from a book not by Bret Easton Ellis, but by Bret Easton Ellis's friend, Jay McInerney, called Story of My Life. Now, there was a film adaptation of this book in 2000, but before I talk about the movie, I want to cut to a short review that my friend Christian Feliciano did on this book, and I'll leave a link to his YouTube channel in the description below.
American Psycho always seems to come up when you talk about disturbing books, and it's understandable. It's a disturbing book. It's violent, it's gory, it's nasty, it's revolting, it's everything everybody says it is. But the reason why I love this book as much as I do is because when you dig under the ice of violence and gore, you find an ocean of way more meaningful elements in this book. You see political and social statements, statements about class and how one class sees the other class, or vice versa, depending on which class you belong to when you read this. You see an honesty that most authors try to avoid when they write their characters. Most authors, when writing characters, will often try their hardest to make characters act in a way that the reader expects them to, or in a way that will make the characters more likable. But Bret Easton Ellis does this beautiful thing, in all of his books, not just this one, where he shows you how people are, not how they should be. When the characters interact in American Psycho, they lie, they exaggerate, they show off, they pretend to be things that they are not. And even though they are beautiful, the way Bret Easton Ellis portrays them makes them seem ugly. And because they seem ugly, the world around them seems ugly. And I love how he does that. He can take extravagant lifestyles and make them seem horrific. Patrick Bateman himself is the very embodiment of this. He is beautiful on the outside, rich, powerful, and yet he seems like such an ugly character. Yes, there are times you can sympathize with him, but there are times when you are just glad you don't live in his world. The violent nature of his is up for debate, But what isn't up for debate is whether or not he is an interesting character. And he certainly is. Love him, hate him, you can't deny that he's at the very least a fascinating character to read about. And what makes it even better is the writing itself. Bret Easton Ellis' prose style is amazing. His words just flow so beautifully and easily. No BS, no cliches, no cringe. Like the 1% version of Chuck Palahniuk, if you know what I mean. Overall, this book is great, and I highly recommend anyone who can stomach a bit of violence to read it. Now, I didn't mention the violence, because I'm sure Christian has already gone into it, but yes, it is a very violent book, and, you know, if you just go in and expect the violence, you'll be fine. And if you've read other authors like Jack Ketchum or Stephen King, not really. I mean, Stephen King's violent, but not as much as this. Or if you read Marquis de Sade or any really violent books, you know, like really disturbing books, Chuck Palahniuk, then you'll be okay with this. Or maybe not okay, but you'll go into this and you'll be able to stomach it. You'll be able to stomach it. But if you don't read those kinds of books, then I would highly recommend just being careful. That's all I say. Just be very cautious. Don't give this to your kids. Read this, if with caution. That's all I gotta say. Just read it with caution. And yeah, thank you so much for listening. Bye.
I hope you enjoyed my friend's take on this book, and sorry about the dramatic change in lighting. Now on to my short review of the film adaptation of American Psycho. Now, the movie was directed by Mary Harron. I'm not sure if I'm saying her last name right. And the movie was quite polarizing when it came out, but it has developed a following over the years to a point where a lot of film buffs pretty much consider it to be a cinema classic, and it's pretty much considered by a lot of film fans to be one of the great films of the last 20 years. And I think the movie did a really good job at condensing a lot of stuff from the book and changing things, but still staying true to the general themes of the novel. Now, I know Bret Easton Ellis was not crazy about the movie, mainly because he didn't really write American Psycho to be made into a film, but even he admitted that the movie did give his novel a whole new life. He also admitted that being that the film was made by women, it really got people to sort of reevaluate his novel, which, as I said, at the time, was considered to be a misogynistic novel. But yeah, the movie's excellent, I think, and the movie did a brilliant job at taking a lot of Patrick Bateman's monologues about music, which were their own chapters in the book, and incorporating those into the scenes where he's killing people, where pretty much right before he kills somebody, he would usually go on some spiel about Huey Lewis and the News or Phil Collins or something. And I gotta say that Phil Collins' song Sussudio was used to brilliant effect in that movie. And everybody remembers the scene where he kills Paul Allen based on the character of Paul Owen from the book while listening to Hip to Be Square by Huey Lewis and the News. And that scene has been parodied many times afterwards. Actually, Huey Lewis himself and Weird Al did a really funny parody of that scene. I forgot whether it was a Funny or Die sketch or a College Humor skit. In the film, Christian Bale plays Patrick Bateman, and I definitely think it's one of his best performances. Like, in that film, he inhabits Bateman. Actually, Bret Easton Ellis told a really funny story that while the movie was being made, him and Christian Bale had lunch together, and he came to him in character as Patrick Bateman, and apparently it really freaked Bret Easton Ellis out to a point where he was like, okay, never do that again. Christian Bale's performance as Patrick Bateman and the movie itself really did make Patrick Bateman a very iconic character, maybe even more so than the book. Now, I do consider American Psycho to be a horror film, even though it's much more than just a horror film, but Patrick Bateman is considered by some people to be a horror movie icon, with some people even ranking him alongside the likes of Freddy Krueger, Jason, Michael Myers, and Chucky. The movie also had Willem Dafoe as Detective Kimball, Reese Witherspoon as Evelyn, Jared Leto as Paul Allen, who, as I said, was based on the character of Paul Owen in the book. The movie also had Chloe Savini, I think is how you say her last name, as Patrick's secretary, Jean. Now, the movie does tone down a lot of the sex and violence from the book, but that's understandable because if they even went a quarter as far as the book did, the movie would have easily gotten an NC-17 or an X rating. Now, there was a direct-to-DVD sequel to American Psycho, and I should use sequel in quotes because it wasn't originally made as a sequel, but there was a film called American Psycho 2, which had Mila Kunis and William Shatner. I remember renting that movie from Blockbuster. This was back when Blockbusters were still around, back when I was 14, and I remember even at 14, I was like, wow, this sucks, and I shut it off, and I've never watched the movie since then. From what I understand, the movie was not originally made to be a sequel to American Psycho, but they sort of shoehorned in a subplot about how the main character was one of Patrick Bateman's victims who escaped. Now, even though Bret Easton Ellis did not write that movie, he has pretty much disassociated himself with that, and I know Mila Kunis is actually pretty embarrassed by the movie. Now, Patrick Bateman actually did show up in the film adaptation of The Rules of Attraction, however that scene was cut from the movie. But in the cut scene, Patrick Bateman was played by Casper Van Dien. Originally, Roger Avary, who directed that movie, wanted Christian Bale to come back and play Patrick, but Bale turned down the role, and then he offered the role to Bret Easton Ellis himself, who turned it down because he thought it would have been too cheesy and too gimmicky to play his own character. There's also been a musical based on American Psycho, and for years FX has been trying to do a TV series set in present day about an older Patrick Bateman training an apprentice. And apparently, if it does get made, it is going to be in continuity with the movie, obviously ignoring the continuity of American Psycho 2, but I don't even think that counted as canon, even when it came out. But yeah, that was my review on American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, and bye.